name is Matt, and I have 2 degrees. And assuming the release schedule goes according to plan, today marks the start of Vampire Weekend. No, not them. This weekend, the Teacup for One Spooky Movie Marathon is going batty, and we are talking all things vampires. Yeah, I don't have fangs. But fun fact, vampires didn't have fangs until movies in like the 1950s. Probably should have done a video on that. Oh well. Now, based on my labor-intensive Wikipedia research, vampires have been around forever. But our modern perception of vampires has almost been entirely shaped by movies. Specifically, one movie. Even more specifically, one very illegal movie and the lawsuit that followed. But first, some boring context. There are ancient myths and folklore surrounding the undead embedded in every culture. Just people seem to have this primal fascination with life beyond death, and that's really the root of all of our monsters. So first, you have your incorporeal undead. So those are like your disembodied undead. So ghosts and all the subcategories of ghosts, of which there are a ton. And I'm sure that video will come one day, but just for now, we'll say blanket statement, ghosts. Then you have your corporal, not like corporal, but like they're made of corpse. They're a corpse. They have a physical body, yet they're still undead. So that's like your mummies and your moving skeletons and your zombies and, of course, your vampires. Really, when you think about it, which, trust me, I have, zombies, vampires, and friendly dancing skeletons, they're kind of all the exact same creature, but the only thing that's different about them are just the rules that are governing the mythology of their existence. But the really extra special thing with vampires, and by extra special I mean mildly unsettling, is the fact that their existence has always walked this very fine line between fact and fiction, to the point where there are multiple documented historical vampire epidemics. And not like ancient vampire epidemics. Some of these things have happened like within the last 300 years. Some of these epidemics are more recent than the Salem witch trials. The most notable probably would have been the 18th century vampire controversy that took place in Eastern Europe and Transylvania, where allegedly there were a string of attacks of these creatures of the night. And I wish I could say that I did a bunch of research and found out scientific explanations for what was going on, but I did do a bunch of research and I found really no scientific explanations for what went on, and even the local governments were convinced that they had vampires. So, regardless of whether or not there were actual vampire attacks happening in Eastern Europe and Transylvania in the 18th century, I suspect this is why we tie vampires to that region of the world so strongly. Now, a few generations later, there was a second vampire epidemic, because yes, there have been more than one, in the late 19th century, and that's when we started to see vampire fiction popping up. First there was Polydori's The Vampire, P-Y-R-E, which, incidentally, was written for the same writing competition that Mary Shelley composed Frankenstein for. Then there was the 1872 lesbian vampire novel Carmilla, and then in 1897, Bram Stoker put pen to paper and created Dracula. Stoker's novel drew from existing vampire mythology, and the name was inspired by the real name of Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Dracula. Dracula itself had like mild success while Stoker was still alive, but it was after his death that the novel really started to gain popularity, specifically through its adaptations and the controversies surrounding those adaptations. Which brings us to the 1922 German Expressionist classic Nosferatu, the first filmic adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. It was directed by F.W. Murnau, and it starred Max Schreck as the title character Nosferatu, another word for vampire, and in the years and decades that have followed, this film has solidified itself as one of the most influential early horror films of all time. But here's the kicker, it was blatant plagiarism. The filmmakers didn't obtain the rights to Stoker's novel. Instead, they just made a ton of changes to try to push it forward as their own story, loosely inspired by Dracula. So they changed things like character names, locations, plot details, and in doing so, they actually set the standard for a lot of elements of vampire mythology that still exist in our consciousness today. First, they renamed the main vampire. So instead of Count Dracula, we had Count Orlok. Instead of being a humanoid creature that ages in reverse like in Stoker's novel, he instead became a rodent-like predator. Ooh, look at those teeth. Look at those claws. Look at those ears. They also fully eliminated the whole plot element of vampires creating new vampires. Instead of making new vampires, all Nosferatu does is just feed like the predator he is. And there's also this cool element about how the town is reacting to vampirism, thinking that it's the plague, and so they immediately jump on taking all the preventative measures to make sure that the plague doesn't spread, like making sure that everyone locks themselves in their houses and that they're all social distancing. But of course, this is fiction. That would never happen in real life. Oh, and while we're talking about the film, there's also this shot that's important for German Expressionism reasons. But I talked about German Expressionism in the first episode, so, I mean, if you missed that episode, you gotta keep up. Anyway, the filmmakers were hoping that these changes to the story would be enough to make it its own story so that they wouldn't have to worry about being sued. Oh, it didn't work. They got sued so hard. Shortly after the premiere, Bram Stoker's widow, Florence Balcombe, and the executor of his estate, I think that's what she was. Anyway, she found out about the film, and she started an intense legal battle against the filmmakers. And to be fair, in his lifetime, Bram Stoker really didn't get to see Dracula become super successful, or at the very least, he didn't make much, if any, money off of it, and Balcombe was struggling financially, so the fact that this film, Nosferatu, was gearing up to be a great financial hit, pretty fair grounds to call the lawyers. Anyway, after Balcombe started her lawsuit, the production company that made Nosferatu decided to declare bankruptcy so that they wouldn't have to pay her. However, her next step was to order that every copy of Nosferatu, right down to the original negative, be destroyed. Now, she almost succeeded in eradicating the Nosferatu film completely. However, some copies had already been sent overseas and into other countries, including a copy that was sent to America, where, because of clerical issues apparently, Dracula was already in the public domain. So that meant that Nosferatu fell into this weird sort of limbo state of being an undead film. So, what was Balcombe's next step of retaliation? She figured if she couldn't kill Nosferatu completely, she would steal its spotlight. So she sold the rights to Bram Stoker's novel for an officially licensed theatrical production. Dracula was then adapted for the stage by playwright Hamilton Dean. The production was a huge success and opened up in England, and then in 1927 it was moved to New York City, where it premiered on Broadway, starring Hungarian actor Bela Lugosi as the vampire who would go on to define all vampires. But what about Nosferatu? Well, that movie became the stuff of legends. There was no definitive cut. There was no original negative. It would screen over the decades infrequently, and it became this movie, this grail of sorts that was highly sought after by fans, becoming the world's first cult film and granting the movie this sort of appropriately vampiric immortality. And the really cool thing that is just so special is the fact that over time, both films, Nosferatu and Universal's Dracula, have defined our modern perception of vampires in their own ways. Nosferatu introduced us to the primal, animalistic vampire who perished in the sun. Yes, also, the Nosferatu film invented that part of the mythology, the whole thing like, if a vampire is touched by sun, they'll burn to death, 100% Nosferatu. And Universal's Dracula, specifically Bela Lugosi as Dracula, introduced us to the hypnotic, seductive, romanticized vampire. And the reason we have both is because of this crazy copyright dispute. Just think, if the filmmakers behind Nosferatu weren't trying to avoid being sued in the first place, they wouldn't have made all those changes that gave us a new type of vampire, and if Balcombe wasn't trying to detract attention away from Nosferatu, she wouldn't have fast-tracked getting a theatrical production of Dracula on its feet that eventually transformed into the Universal Studios Dracula movie. So really, at the end of the day, who do we have to thank for giving us these terrifying, blood-sucking demons that haunt our souls? Lawyers. But for now, friends, that concludes yet another episode of Teacup 401. Let me know in the comment section down below, what kind of vampire is your favorite? And if you want to follow me for the rest of Vampire Weekend or for the rest of my Halloween movie marathon, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. It's so easy. All you need to do is click on my face. Thank you for joining me today, everyone. My name is Matt, and I have 2 degrees, and that's the T cup for one.